So I'm sure that a lot of you realized that I reorganized the order of the book, right? I mean, that should be evident already. For some reason, our book talks about learning before memory. And you have to have memory in order to learn. So it just makes sense to me conceptually to talk about memory first. And this is by far some of the most basic, fundamental, but fascinating stuff. Like the applicability of the content that we're going to talk about this week in regards to memory and learning is awesome, right? It's everything that you're doing. Like if I could teach learning and memory before I taught the fundamentals of, psychology and old white dudes and states of consciousness and things like that, I would. Because starting off with this is the sweet spot. And you guys have seen when you get to the expand content for this week, you're going to see that we've got a lot of information on study tips, memorizing, test taking, lots of really helpful information. We wanted to make sure that you were actually getting to see how this science is utilized. For today, right, at the end of today's experience, you should understand the process of encoding and recalling, right, specific to your life experience. And then at the end of this unit, you should be able to articulate how, right? We'll probably get to this on Wednesday, but how memory influences learning. Okay. So here we have the model of the mind. Now, experience, encoding, decoding, right? There, all the boxes represent so many different things. So I'm going to lay out for you guys what we do when we basically create a full diagram of this model of the mind. Now, this first box, if you want to go ahead and type into the chat what you think goes in that first box, that would be awesome. All right. Encoding, okay, all right. You'd be wrong, but I appreciate it, right? When we talk about the model of the mind, how in the hell am I drawing white over here? I don't understand. When we talk about model of the mind, we are going to talk specifically about how we use this. And for some reason I cannot, there we go. My God, all of the technological for the life of me. All right, so the first thing we put in the box is actually, and I'm gonna label this out for you. Our first box gets short-term memory, okay? Short-term memory goes into our first box. Sure, this is kind of part of encoding. So when our textbook talks about encoding, storage, and retrieval, there are many, many different steps along the way for encoding. The first thing we have to have, or the first memory storage that we have, is sensory memory. But prior to sensory memory, we have to have, and please create this diagram on your own and label it with the full terms. I'm just using shorthand for efficiency. The first thing we have that's supposed to be an S and an I, that's sensory input. Okay, sensory input. Sensory input happens first. Okay, sensory input comes in, and it is one of the ways. It's fundamentally necessary in order for us to do anything. We have to have sensory input that goes into that short-term, that sensory memory. So sensory memory is in our first box, not short-term memory. Sensory memory is in our first box. Then we have sensory input that feeds into sensory memory. Now, sensory memory is tricky, right? Because traditionally speaking, those of you that are in this space, I just want you to yell out at me. How many senses do we have? 5, right? We all think about 5. Today, in our science, we actually talk about 8 plus. Okay? We have different sensory systems throughout our entire body. Sure, we have the big 5, right? We have auditory, we have olfactory, we have our taste buds, we have our vision, we have our sense of touch, right? And that's one of the things that informed Wilhelm Wundt's first psychological study. Taste, touch, smell, sight, sound. The 6th one that I typically tell students about is what we call proprioception. And that's balance. We have sensory receptors throughout our muscles and tendons and also in our inner ear that tell us where gravity is, that help us understand where this is. So when information is coming in, and it always comes in sensorily, right? For those people who say, oh, I'm an auditory learner, oh, I'm a visual learner, oh, I'm a kinesthetic learner, we've debunked learning styles today. What we have is sensory dominance. Right? You can actually learn doing any of those things. You have sensory dominances. You specifically have different sensory systems that you place more resources in than in others. Okay? You're not predisposed genetically or anything else like that. It's a habit that you've gotten into. That's why we've moved away from learning like styles like that. Instead, we want to provide you with as many different things as possible. This is one of the reasons why I opted into having a face-to-face class this semester, right? I'm a relational learner. I'm also a visual learner. I'm a context-dependent learner. All of that sensory information that comes in, right, that becomes part of that sensory memory is about the environment that you're in physically, who you're around, what does the chair feel like on your seat, what do you do just before class, what do you do while you're in class? All of this becomes part of your memory. How many of you heard a memory from somebody where they were able to talk about what it felt like emotionally, but they were also able to describe how warm it was, what the light was like, what they saw, maybe what colors were present? Granted, you guys didn't have a lot of time to go into a whole lot of detail, but when we bring something in, attached to it is all 5 of those systems that we typically talk about, in addition to 3 other systems that our culture doesn't talk about very much lately, but including proprioception, right? Where we are relative to gravity. And so all of that comes in. All of that right now is attached to your understanding of this moment. So all of that is information. And what happens is we get that information into sensory memory, and it is not there for long, okay? Not there for long at all. Very, very seconds, tenths of a second amount of time for some of our sensory systems. And what happens is we take that information in and we have to decide right then, is this relevant or is this not relevant? Do I need this or do I not need this? Now, unfortunately, this is where all of our biases come in. Our biases that are born from previous experience, however poorly informed. But if we're walking down the street and we see somebody walking towards us, right, and they have a long trench coat on and they're walking rather stiffly and it's warm outside, okay, our brain takes in that sensory information. It says, is this relevant or is this not relevant? And then moves on with it. Make a decision. Okay, most of that doesn't stick around. The people that cannot filter that have a special designation in our culture. We call them on the autism spectrum. The people that struggle to filter out that sensory information and take in all of the information all of the time and deem it all relevant are the ones that have sensitivity to sensory stimuli. Okay? Or maybe they have the next evolution in sensory processing and they're more effective than some of us. But because they're different, we think it's wrong or aberrant. So all of this information is coming in. It lasts tenths of a second in some sensory systems. And then what do you think we need in order to get something to move from sensory memory into our second box, which is short-term / working memory. And I'll explain to you why we put the slash in there. And my handwriting is a lot better than that. I just can't write on the screen. So I know, so many excuses. What do you guys think? What do we need? Consolidation. Okay. I think they look like they need to see a doctor and not a psychologist. Okay. All right. Bottom of a light bulb. Oh, how funny. You guys are talking about the picture on the PowerPoint. Okay. All right. Let's answer the question. What do we need in order to get something to go from sensory memory into short-term memory? What do we need? Rehearsal. Thank you, Maddie. Focus. Okay. Thank you, Brady. Attention. Thank you, Kai. Excellent. Attention is exactly what we need, right? We have to pay attention in order to move anything along in this system. Oh my God. You guys, you know I'm writing with the end of a pencil eraser. That word right here is supposed to be attention. I know. I Rebecca the English. I really do. Yeah, you got to pay attention. Okay. If you don't pay attention, it's not going to end up in short-term / working memory. It's not going to happen. Okay. So right now, what I want you guys to do is I want you to, in the chat, write what color my mask is. Is it blue facing or white facing right now? Did you pay attention? Right? Is it blue facing or white facing? Let's see how you did. Why? Is this just gaslighting us? I'm not entirely sure what you mean. I hear you laughing up there. I know what gaslighting means. Okay, purple. Thank you, Austin. I gave you the choices of blue or white, and you choose to go with purple. Okay, respect. Okay, there we go. Right? Did you get it right? Some of you got it wrong. Right? Even though it's something that you've seen, even though it's something you've been exposed to. Okay? You have to pay attention. You thought it was a trick question. Okay, thanks, Brady. You have to pay attention. If you don't pay attention, it's not going to make it into that short-term / working memory, and that's why you guys couldn't recall it, because it didn't go anywhere. So in order to pay attention, so if you're studying and you're like, why can't I get this? Why can't I get this? Why can't I get this? You have to think about where your resources are going. So right now, some of you have Zoom open on your screen, right? So you can listen. A lot of y'all got your social media up, you got your email up. All of that is pulling your attention, right? It's moving that away. You have to pay attention in order for anything to make it into that short-term / working memory. All right, so our last box, Kai, we could discuss the study with the gorilla passing the basketballs. And that study is about attention and about how, right, similar to the mask experiment that I just did with you guys, if you're not attending to it or if your focus is in one area, you're going to miss a lot of other things that are happening. I don't know how many times we've been surprised by people doing stuff or creating experiences. What does that LM stand for? Go ahead and just pop it into the chat. Just so you know, when I'm normally, thank you, yes, long-term memory. When I am in a classroom full of 250 people, the people talking to me all at the same time, it doesn't scare me. I miss that energy a little bit. So what do we have to have from short-term memory into long-term? What do we need to do here? What has to happen? Go ahead and give me your guest in the chat. Rehearsal, okay. Rehearsal, repetition, sleep. Yes, sleep is one of them. repetition, rehearsal. Okay. What we actually need and what we do here is encoding. Okay. Some of you guessed that sensory memory was encoding, right? Because it's sort of the beginning of our storage, our long-term storage process. So you got to get the information in. Like, how many different ways are there to encode? I just told you that all of your sensory information goes in whenever any of the information shows up. So if I were to tell you, and I always tell my students this, if you intentionally, right, chew the same kind of gum when you come to class that when you study, you're going to have better recall on the test if you're chewing that gum, because that sense of smell and that sense of taste are part of the memory that goes with the content. Okay, the structure of the uncomfortable stadium seats that you're in, or maybe the cushy, pushy bed that you're sitting on if you're sitting at home. All of that also gets encoded. So when we talk about encoding and we're getting that information in, you want to put as many tethers onto that information as possible. This is why we ask you guys to make personal references. This is why I asked you to share a personal memory and here's somebody else's personal memory, is so that now those personal memories become part of the data. And you can use that information in order to recall it. Okay, and that recalling is the arrow that brings that information out of long-term and puts it into the same holding pattern as our short-term, but now we have a new name for it, and that new name is called working memory. Okay, so we recall right here, the information goes into long-term. Later on, we bring it out of long-term, and that goes into our working memory. It's only short-term once. After we pull it out of long-term multiple times, it's always working memory. It's short-term only coming in once. Now, short-term memory, we know that it's limited in how many bits of data. Like you can hold 7 plus or minus 2 bits of data. And you can only hold on to information in short-term memory for about 30 seconds without actively using it. You know, like the rehearsal, what you guys were mentioning that allows it, you had mentioned rehearsal as if that's what gets it into long-term memory, and that's not what gets it into long-term memory. Rehearsing is what you're doing when you're holding that information into short-term. You want to study well for yourself. What you want to do is you want to practice putting those things into long-term and then pulling them back out. Practice pulling them back out. Don't sit there and practice with flashcards, right? Repeatedly. After you go through your flashcards maybe once, maybe twice, put them away and then look at them later, giving yourself some time and distance so your memory, that short-term memory, can kind of shut off. Otherwise, you're just holding it. You're not actually practicing recalling. And practicing recalling is so important because that's what we're looking for, right? If I'm a flexible educator in many ways. I would love to find a way for you guys to show me what you know that didn't involve you relying on your memory systems, right? That would be great. That would be really great. But I have yet to have a way with 250 people to adequately provide an assessment that does not use any multiple choice at all, right? I haven't figured it out yet. In order to test you, right? To see if you actually understand what we're talking about. One of the things that you'll notice on our assessments is that we really work to leave a blank on the test, right? So it'll say, Sally is an undergraduate student and she is interested in being a clinical psychologist. Sally needs blank degree in order to be a clinical psychologist. So we work on having you guys fill in the blank. That way we can provide you with lots of cues and clues to help you recall that information, right? We want to give you as much information as possible in order to empower you with being able to pull that information out of long-term memory. And honestly, when you approach your assessments and you use this science and you even use this language, there are some memory enthusiasts that use the mind palace, and there are some that use filing cabinets, where you can have everything organized for yourself based upon a topic in this very succinct visual system. Well, it's visual, right? So that's one of our sensory systems. Auditory, one of our sensory systems. Tactile, and it's not so much kinesthetic learning as one of the things that we get to do when we're manipulating things is we get to sort of build a 360-degree understanding. It's not so much just doing something with your body, right? It's building a relationship with the content that makes that memory system so important, or that learning approach so important. So we recall that information, and y'all mentioned this super fun dynamic of rehearsal, right? Pulling that information out. Oh, Jesus, this pencil, killing me. Rehearsal, believe it or not, that's what that word says right there. Encoding, I think, is the only legible item on there. Oh. Rehearsal, right? Holding that information in there. So the first time a bit of information comes in, it comes first through sensory information, okay? You have lots of senses that are on point, and you decide within seconds, is this relevant, is this not relevant, moving on. If it's relevant, then I pay attention to it, right? I engage with it. I dedicate my sensory systems to that. And then from that, right, from that attention, it goes into my short term. And then if I decide it's short term that it really is relevant and it's something that I'm probably going to use later, I take that from short term memory and I encode it. Okay, and again, there are so many different ways to encode information. Please be sure to check out the different ways we do that in our textbook. I think, right, and the science bears this out every time, the most meaningful thing you could do with any information is make it personal. Because if you can find personal relevance in something, you've already attached so much more content to it, and you'll be able to recall it with great efficiency. So that's my 2 cents, having that personal connection. So that goes into long-term memory through the encoding. And then when it comes time to retrieve it, right, we recall it, right? We pull it out of our long-term memory store, and that becomes working memory, and we use it. Yes, you can use rehearsal as a memorization technique, but what it's not the rehearsing that allows you to encode it, right? It's the relationship that you're building with the content to encode it. One of the best ways to encode information is to teach it to somebody else. Try to explain it to somebody else, especially if that person's willing to provide you with some challenges and say, can you provide me with another example? One of my favorite things about teaching a live class is that you guys ask me questions, you know, or even just the questions that we got on the exit ticket. I get questions that push me to think, that allow me to get better and understand more of what I'm doing. So all that is wicked, wicked powerful.